The Cold War was not a single event, but a global struggle that defined the second half of the 20th century. For 46 years, the world lived in the shadow of total destruction. At its heart, it was a clash of ideologies, the democratic, capitalist West versus the communist, authoritarian East. Two systems, both claiming to offer the best path for humanity. It began when the common enemy, Nazi Germany, was defeated. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly dissolved into suspicion and rivalry. At conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, the Big Three leaders attempted to reshape the post-war world, but the seeds of conflict were already being sown over the future of Poland and Germany. The U.S. demonstration of atomic power in 1945 ended the Pacific War, but terrified Moscow. Stalin accelerated the Soviet nuclear project, determined to match the American threat. In 1946, diplomat George Kennan argued that the Soviet Union was committed to destroying the West, necessitating a containment policy to stop the spread of communism. Winston Churchill gave this reality a name. In Missouri, he declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, separating the free West from the Soviet-dominated East. The U.S. responded with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, pledging aid to resist communism and investing billions to rebuild the shattered economies of Western Europe. Germany became the central front. Divided into 4 occupation zones, the country was a microcosm of the global divide, with the West and East pulling in opposite directions. In 1948, Stalin blockaded West Berlin. The West responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in millions of tons of supplies for 11 months until the blockade was lifted. By 1949, the lines were drawn. NATO was formed as a collective defense against Soviet aggression. In August of that same year, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, ending the American nuclear monopoly. Then, China fell to communism under Mao Zedong. The Red Scare began to sweep across the United States. In 1950, the Cold War turned hot in Korea. A UN coalition led by the U.S. fought to defend the South from a communist invasion. A daring landing at Incheon temporarily turned the tide, but as UN forces neared the Chinese border, Mao sent hundreds of thousands of troops into the war. The war ended in a brutal stalemate, leaving the peninsula divided to this day. The template for Proxy Wars was set. Following Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev took power, speaking of peaceful coexistence even as tensions simmered. When Hungary attempted to break away in 1956, Khrushchev sent in the tanks. The brutal suppression showed the world that Soviet dominance was not optional. 1957 changed everything. The launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, proved the Soviets had the rockets to reach American soil. A panicked U.S. poured billions into science and education, founding NASA and racing to get the first American into orbit. In 1961, the Iron Curtain became physical. To stop citizens from fleeing to the West, East Germany built the Berlin Wall. At Checkpoint Charlie, tanks from both sides stood barrel to barrel, a single spark away from starting World War III. In Cuba, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion pushed Fidel Castro closer to the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cold War's most dangerous moment. The closest the world ever came to nuclear war was in October 1962. U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba. For 13 days, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev engaged in a terrifying game of nuclear chicken. The crisis ended when the Soviets removed the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The world breathed again. Attention then turned to Vietnam. Since 1954, the country was divided, with the U.S. backing the anti-communist South against the communist North. Following the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, President Johnson rapidly escalated U.S. involvement, eventually sending 500,000 troops to Vietnam. But the struggle continued in Southeast Asia. The U.S. became deeply mired in the Vietnam War, seeking to stop the domino effect. The war divided America, sparking a massive protest movement and shaking the nation's confidence in its Cold War strategy. In 1968, the Soviet Union crushed the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, proving that reform within the Eastern Bloc would not be tolerated. The U.S. claimed a major symbolic victory in 1969 when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, demonstrating American technological and economic power. By 1975, the U.S. had withdrawn and South Vietnam fell. It was a major blow to American containment policy. In the 1970s, a period of détente began, a thawing of relations characterized by arms limitation treaties like SALT. Nixon's historic visit to China aimed to drive a wedge between the two communist giants, reshaping the global balance. The peak of détente was the 1975 Apollo-Soyuz mission, where American and Soviet crews met in space for a symbolic handshake in the stars. Détente collapsed in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The Cold War was frozen once again. In 1989, a wave of peaceful revolutions swept through Eastern Europe. One by one, communist regimes began to crumble. President Ronald Reagan took a hard line, labeling the USSR an evil empire and launching the Strategic Defense Initiative. Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, a space-based system designed to render Soviet nuclear weapons obsolete. A 1983 NATO exercise nearly triggered a Soviet nuclear response, reminding both sides how close they were to the brink. The turning point came in 1985 with Mikhail Gorbachev. He realized the Soviet system was failing and introduced radical reforms. Glasnost brought openness and perestroika sought to restructure the economy, but the changes could not be contained. He also launched perestroika to restructure the stagnant economy, but these reforms inadvertently emboldened nationalist movements across the empire. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster exposed the deep flaws and secrecy of the Soviet system, accelerating Gorbachev's drive for total transparency. The two leaders formed an unlikely bond, signing historic treaties to eliminate entire classes of nuclear missiles. In 1987, Reagan issued his famous challenge, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The pressure for change in Eastern Europe was becoming unstoppable. The two leaders signed the INF Treaty, the first agreement to actually eliminate an entire class of nuclear missiles, signaling that the end of the Cold War was possible. By 1989, Gorbachev had withdrawn all Soviet troops from Afghanistan, ending a decade of war that had drained the nation's morale and resources. That same year, a wave of peaceful revolutions swept through Eastern Europe. Gorbachev made the historic decision not to use force to stop them. On November 9th, the Berlin Wall was opened. The symbol of the Cold War was torn down by the people it was meant to divide. Within a year, Germany was reunified. The primary flashpoint of the Cold War was gone, but the Soviet Union itself was now on the verge of collapse. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev. It failed, but transferred real power to Boris Yeltsin and sealed the USSR's fate. By December 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War was over, ending not with a bang, but with a signature. The legacy of the Cold War still shapes our world, from the nuclear arsenals that remain to the borders of modern-day nations. But the legacy remains. Thousands of nuclear warheads still exist, a lasting reminder of the era when humanity first learned how to destroy itself. It was an era of unprecedented danger and competition, a testament to the resilience of humanity in the face of absolute destruction. Thank you for watching this 10-minute history of the Cold War. Subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world.